Well, it's time, Wednesday night, time to take up our Bibles again and spend some time in some Bible study. We have, over these past weeks, been looking at Matthew chapter 6 and the Lord's Prayer. The prayer, of course, comes in the context of a conversation that Jesus was having. And so, having finished the Lord's Prayer, as recorded for us in Matthew, I thought I'd go to the verses preceding. And just spend tonight, we're just going to have a look at some of these verses, and just a good opportunity for us to do some soul searching, and knowing that the Spirit of God lives within us and is constantly at work, searching us and convicting us, leading us on in just repentance and growth in our walk of faith. So please bow your heads with me and let's just pray together. Lord, we remember the words of the psalmist praying that you would search his heart. And Matthew chapter 6, reading from verse 5. We have been reading parts of this passage again and again over these past weeks, but let's focus on it tonight. So from verse 5 to verse 9. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. And then, of course, he goes on to tell them to pray like this. Now that's part of a passage, and of course I want us to look at just the broader passage, but just to begin the study, to get us thinking about the fact that we do get involved in spiritual disciplines. There are many things we do. Some people have referred to spiritual disciplines as holiness habits. They're things we do, and the reason we do them is because they're a means that God uses to grow us and to lead us and to nurture us, and in fact even just to build our relationship with him. And so therefore, needing to ask, and coming to a passage like this tonight, asking the question, what is the underlying motive? Why would you want to do or be involved in spiritual disciplines, whether it be the studying of the word, whether it be coming together on a Sunday in worship with others? There must be a motive, and of course there is a value in these things that we do, and you determine, and certainly I do determine, to do certain things because we believe there is value in doing them. Well, Jesus gives us some insight tonight in this passage, and he's teaching on the matter of three very specific spiritual disciplines, very familiar disciplines, and he digs right into the heart of the matter. And that was why, in fact, I gave the title to this Bible study, The Heart of the Matter. Jesus goes beyond the superficial. And he's asking his disciples, in fact, he's challenging his disciples to examine their hearts and to see what it is that moves them. What value do they perceive that they are getting from their involvement into this particular discipline? Well, a good place for us to start, just looking at the passage, is to begin to identify the specific spiritual disciplines or the holiness habits that Jesus is speaking about here. So my very first point tonight, I've just called it Some Habits Many of You Have. These are habits any one of us, believers, and probably even more than these, but we'll confine our discussion to these specific habits that Jesus raises. Now the first three sections, in fact, of Matthew chapter 6 deals with three spiritual practices. I read only one of them. There are three spiritual practices that were prevalent in Judaism. This is what the Jews did. And of course, that spilled over into the early church and in fact continues in many quarters in our world in Christendom today. But I want you to notice in this passage that Jesus takes it for granted. He assumes that those who call themselves disciples or followers, or as we would say believers, they will give themselves to these habits. So he's not commanding them in this particular instance to do them. He's merely assuming them. So if you have a look at the passage, you'll notice in verse 2 and verse 5 and even down to verse 16, he uses the word when you. So there will be times, there are occasions when you do these things. And so he's conveying that they're already doing these things. It's indeed what they are busy doing. And so therefore, again, to say that this is not a command from Jesus that we do these things, not in this passage, you may do so elsewhere, but he wants to go beyond the doing of these things. And so let's have a look at them. And the passage, of course, as I said, is not a directive. It's basically assumed, and in the first instance by Jesus, that disciples, and it's the first point, disciples are generous. I think we've seen that. I've seen that over my years in the ministry, but specifically at Central. Many stories can be told of unexpected generosity from believers within the context of the church. Just even over this COVID season, I remember when we first went down into lockdown, there were unusual gifts, anonymous gifts given to the church to help people who were in need. And that's just one example. And again and again, we just see people where there is a specific need, people respond generously. And so Jesus says in the second verse, he says, so when you give to the needy. So he assumes, as a matter of course, that they think it is a solemn duty to be generous towards those in need, to give according to their means, and of course to do so to relieve the needs of others. Now this matter of generosity, or the matter of looking out for the needs of others, is certainly commanded in the Old Testament, number of passages, in fact even in the New Testament. But Deuteronomy 15:11, there will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you, as the generosity, to be open-handed toward your brothers and toward the poor and needy in your land. So this is a practice established, commanded amongst the people of God already back in Deuteronomy. And the point is that it pleases God. God is pleased when his children act with kindness and generosity toward those who are poor, toward those who have a particular need. And we see too, in Acts chapter 10 and verse 4, where Cornelius stared at him in fear. And what is it, Lord? He asked. And the angel answered, your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering to the Lord. So here was a man, just in the course of his walk of faith, he was displaying generosity, as many other believers were doing, as many other people of God were doing. So that's something we can assume. Disciples are generous. That's a habit. That's a practice that we are involved in. Secondly, we notice that disciples pray. We spent weeks on that, Jesus teaching disciples to pray. But I did find a great statement. In the beginning, Adam had the privilege of speaking to God. We know that. And here's my statement. It was already then that correspondence with heaven was fixed. That, in fact, is a quote from Robert Burns. And the point is that from the very beginning, that opportunity to speak to God, to pray, has continued down through the ages. There is communication that believers can have, that the people of God, the children of God, have with their Father in heaven. And of course, we looked at that passage, Jesus elaborating on how we should do that, and when you pray, and of course, he taught us the disciples or the Lord's Prayer. And in fact, we notice even in the New Testament, after the day of Pentecost, it is one of those things that is identified as a practice that the New Testament church continued to do. They devoted themselves, we're told in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, they devoted themselves to prayer. And of course, amongst other things as well. So generosity, prayer, and the third thing, and perhaps not done as often today as it used to be, and perhaps just our circles, I'm not sure, but disciples fast. Fasting is the occasional abstinence from food, and frequently mentioned in the Bible. You'll find it in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, and generally connected with prayer. In fact, some examples, David fasted, remember, when his child was sick. Daniel fasted when he sought special light and direction from God. Esther fasted before going in to see King Ahasuerus. Paul and Barnabas fasted when they appointed elders. Old Testament, New Testament, prayer and fasting, this is what people do. It's a sense of dependence on God. And we're not commanded in any particular instance to fast, but fasting takes place. And even today, people fast. And Jesus here speaking to his disciples, he considers it as a matter of fact that they are fasting from time to time. So my point is simply this, is that generosity, praying and fasting are just some of the things, some of the holiness habits, some of the spiritual disciplines that we Christians get involved in doing. These things are good and these things are right. And they're not the only ones. There are many other holiness habits or spiritual disciplines. I've listed some of them here. Meditating on the scriptures, that's a good discipline. Memorizing the scriptures, that's a good discipline. Not forsaking the gathering together of the saints. We just looked at that some weeks ago in the book of Hebrews chapter 10. That's a good habit. It's a good spiritual discipline. Acts chapter 2 verse 42, we should continue in that tradition, continuing steadfastly in the apostles' teaching and the breaking of bread and prayer. And so we do all of those things. But this is not the issue. Jesus is not raising the command. He's not challenging them because they're not doing it and they ought to be doing it. There's something else that Jesus is doing here. And I want us to look at those three scenarios, and each one of them beginning with those words, when you, and you will notice that each of them share a common thought. And of course, that common thought addresses the focus of what Jesus is saying and what we can learn here tonight, which leads me to my second main point tonight. What is the common message linking these passages together? So if you look at this passage, and let's just look at our Bibles and notice what follows this statement, when you. So verse 2. So when you give to the needy, there's the generosity. Do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues or on the streets to be honored by men. Verse 5. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. And then verse 16. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. Now, do you get the common link? It's quite... I think striking, it's alarming, it's challenging, it's soul-searching. Jesus recognizes, and I think this is where we ought to be thinking, certainly challenging ourselves, how easy it is for Christian people, for followers of Jesus, to get involved in worthy religious activity, to do good things. But are we doing them for the right reasons? Jesus here challenges the reason as to why they, and of course us, do these many good things. And of course that is my next point then. Jesus challenging your motive and my motive for doing the things we do. I think we can be very busy as Christians in the life of the church. And busyness is good. We ought to work hard. We ought to go the extra mile. We ought to develop in our relationship with God in spiritual maturity, and we ought to be encouraging others, and we ought to be growing ourselves, and all of that requires participation in these different spiritual disciplines. But the question has got to be, as Jesus examines our hearts over here, is why? Why do we do them? Giving generously, praying persistently, or fasting regularly. Why do you do these things? Jesus asks. Is it because you want to do what is right? Is it because you want to please God? Or, and this is the difficult part, this is the awkward part of this passage, are we doing these things to gain a reputation amongst men? Now that's a hard question, of course, to answer, and nobody can answer that question for me or for you other than I for myself and you for you. And so, do we give generously and pray fervently and fast regularly? Not so much doing it because it's right and it pleases God, but doing so rather to be admired by others. And so, is being thought of as generous, is that more important than being generous to please God? Because if it is not to please God, the act of piety becomes an act of impiety. So the godly thing becomes an ungodly thing. You get the point? And again, we can make that same point with prayer. If gaining a reputation for prayerfulness is more important to me or to you than praying when no one but God is listening, then the act of piety becomes an act of impiety, or the act of godliness becomes an act of ungodliness. And of course, the same can be said about fasting. So therefore, we must see tonight that there is definitely a right reason. And that right reason is to please God in the things that we do. The critical something essential to the eternal value of all the godly actions and the many godly actions that there are, done by believers, must be done with the right motive. And so my third point tonight is really motives do make a difference. They really do. If your motive is to gain a reputation, in fact, what Jesus says in this passage, you'll actually get what you want. You'll actually get the very thing you desire. Have a look at the second verse. When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues, on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. Same is said in verse 5. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. Again in verse 16, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, pulling your face and let everybody know that you've been going out without food for 12 days, or not 12 days, 12 hours. I don't think we can manage 12 days. They disfigure their faces to show men they're fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. So Jesus repeats, and there's absolutely no dispute as to what he means, therefore. And the truth is, we can gain a reputation. You can end up having a building named after you. There are many buildings. Last week, I was helping Carol's mom and dad move into their frail care unit. And the unit was called North House. And I thought North House was simply a house that pointed north, until I looked a little bit closer and I saw a plaque that the money was in fact donated by Mr. North. But Mr. North is long forgotten, and nobody even knows who Mr. North is. You get the point? So we can do that. Tributes. Sometimes people are concerned about glowing tributes to be shared at their funeral. And of course, it's even possible to get some kind of award. But the point Jesus is making here, beyond temporal rewards, and folk, temporal rewards are soon forgotten. They are soon forgotten. We need to remember that. It is possible, Jesus is saying here, it is possible to fool others that we're doing religious activity for the right reasons when we're doing for them for the wrong reasons. But we cannot fool God. Cannot fool God. God knows. He knows our thoughts. He knows our motives. He knows them completely, and He knows them thoroughly. And so He tells us here, if your motive in giving and praying and fasting and all those other things is to please God. Now we read again. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then there's a different outcome. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. We see the same in verse 6. When you pray, go to your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen. Different outcome. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Same in verse 17. When you fast, put oil on your head, wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you're fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father, again, different outcome, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. See, folks, the point that Jesus is driving over here is that which is done with the right motive counts in terms of what God assesses value to be. And so ending up, and surely this is what we want at the end of our lives, hearing those words ultimately from God, well done, my good and faithful servant. Want to hear those words, Matthew 25. Surely this is crucial, a priority for us, on top of the promised inheritance of salvation that Peter speaks of in chapter 1 verse 3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In His great mercy He has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus, into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil or fade, kept in heaven for you. Now just a fourth point in conclusion. And so let's think about some implications. What implications are we left with listening to the teaching that Jesus is giving on this particular occasion? I've divided the implications into two facts and two responses. There are two facts that we really need to dwell on. The first one is that sin is subtle and it's ugly. I think we need to recognize that sin is not just something we indulge in, which is conspicuous and it happens when we're far from God. It follows us everywhere. It really does. And sometimes we don't even know we're sinning when we're sinning. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus teaches elaborates so clearly on that. It's not just so much even the deed, but it's even the thought that is seen to be sin. So we need to understand our own hearts, that we are not as we ought to be, that there are, even as believers, the remaining marks of sin that remains subtle and remains ugly. And I'll get to the issue a little bit later, but if we don't identify it, we can't deal with it. If we don't acknowledge that sin is there, that it's ugly, that it's subtle, it's going to stay there. Second fact, which is really the next point, of course, salvation is essential. The sinful heart is subtle and ugly. It needs to be replaced. And of course, we're told that in the book of Ezekiel, heart of stone replaced by heart of flesh, and the need to be born again. But I think I'm speaking mostly to Christians tonight. And I would urge you to understand that even those of us who are born again still need to be sanctified. The process of salvation continues to unfold until either Jesus comes for us, second coming, or He calls for us in death. And then we know that death is gain, because then sin and the struggles with sin will be over. And it's only a new heart that can address even the progress that we need to make as we work on this issue of sanctification, and God works in the issue of sanctification in our lives. So those are two facts. Well, two responses. The first one, search your heart. Psalmist did it. I think it's good that we do it. Paul tells us to do it, even when he speaks about us meeting around the Lord's table, that we ought to examine ourselves. It's good to regularly, to frequently examine ourselves inwardly. Why do I do the things I do? Whether it be preaching, whether it be spiritual disciplines of many of the disciplines I've even mentioned tonight. Why do I give? Why do I pray? Why do I fast? Why do I go to church? Lord, help me in understanding, searching my motives. Am I consumed with wanting to please people? Or am I really wanting to please God? Am I building a reputation amongst men? And don't get me wrong, to have the right kind of reputation is important. We see that in the selection of leaders. We ought to be blameless. People ought to not point fingers at us. And so we've got to watch our hearts, outside of the church, inside the church, and I think regularly. And in fact, I think it's one of the reasons we ought to meet often around the Lord's table. And then just lastly, another response, seek God's grace. We don't need to modify God's standards. We fall short of the glory of God. Romans 3 verse 23. We understand that. God is holy, 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 infinitely holy. We fall short. So we can't modify the standards of God. But what we can do is apply the grace of God. And that's what we ought to do, is recognize that yes, sin crouches at the door. Sin is there. And then humbly coming. Repentance,